Hello, Mario.
Hi, so how's the beach?
The beach is wonderful.
Wonderful.
How you doing?
Good?
You know, it's funny. I picked this one, but I'm not a sand person. I hate sand.
Let's see
We
if I
went
find it.
to, years ago, we went to a few different places that, you had right on the beach. As long as I had a chair and an umbrella and a newspaper, I was fine.
Yeah. Hello, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good
Hello.
evening. Well, let's see if I have. Oh, I don't have any. Okay, I'll be in San Francisco.
Ernie, how are you?
Boker Tov, everybody from Yerushalayim.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to see
Wow,
you.
the sun shines bright at 6 a.m., huh?
Yeah, absolutely. It's cooler. It was very warm.
Hard to hear you, Ernie.
You don't hear me? Okay, that's better. It's it was very warm in Yerushalayim. It's now cooled down a little bit, so that's nice.
Not as warm as here.
Okay. I see Chaim and Yaakov and Norm and Saul. I saw Feinblum for a minute.
He was crossing the bridge.
Yeah. Ernie, I fixed the Daf Yomi from yesterday. I sent you the video.
Thank you.
I watched it today. It was fine. Oh,
think-
no, for the survey I watched.
Okay, we left off on page 143. We learned about how we're supposed to stand and what do we do with our hands. We talked about davening with a pager last week. This shir is the obligation and nature of kavana during Shemona Esrei. We spent a lot of time talking about kavana during Kriya Shema. So what kind of kavana do we need to have during Shemona Esrei? So in this year, we continue our study of the halachos of Shemona Esrei, beginning with a discussion about kavana, which is translated here as concentration or state of mind. We have seen previously that within the context of Kriya Shema, there are two types of kavana. Number one, kavana to fulfill a mitzvah, to be yotzei, and kavana to understand the words being recited. With regards to Shemona Esrei, there also may be multiple types of kavana necessary, though they may differ somewhat than in Kriyat Shema. So one of the sources in the Gemara in Brachos mentions the requirements of kavana during Shemona Esrei. The Gemara states that one must have kavana during his tefillah, in that he must focus his thoughts towards Hashem. So Masechta Brachos Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph Ton Rabbanan Hamispalel Tzorach Sheichayven Es Libo L'Shamayim Abashol Omer Simen Ledavar Tochin Libam Takshiv Oznecha. Prepare your heart. Have your ear be prepared to listen. The Tur codifies this Gemara passage as the halacha. and appears to formulate two main aspects of the requirement for kavanah. Kavanah for the words of the tefillah, kavanah that one is standing before Hashem and removing all other thoughts. Says the Tur, Machshavto Ketzad. What should a person's machshava be during Shemona Esrei? The Tanya. Hamispalot tzor shechav in libo shenemar tochin libam. Perush. What does that mean? Sheichavin perush amilos. Shemotzi b'sfaso. Number one, he needs to understand the definition of the words that he's reciting. V'yachshav ki'ilu shchina kenegdo. Secondly, he needs to have a machshava that the shchina is in front of him. Shinamar, and the Torah brings in another pasuk, Shivisi Hashem lenegdi samid. V'ya'ira kavanavia, and he should, this thought will awaken his kavanah. V'yasir kol machshavos hatrudos, also, and it shall push away all the distracting machshavos away from him. Until he has a pure kavanah, understands the words, and he knows to whom he's standing. The footnote states that the Torah understands the Gemara to be referring to kavanah for the meaning of the words, which is an interpretation already found in Rabbeinu Yonah. Although this does not appear to fit well with the formulation of focus his heart towards heaven, right? Both the Torah and Rabbeinu Yonah do not mention the words l'shamayim in their commentaries, and simply interpret the idea of focus his heart as referring to understanding the words. The version of the text is in fact the one written in the Tosefta itself, which is the original source for the statement. Nevertheless, the Torah mentions the notion of kavanah as thinking that the Shekhinah is present, though it's unclear whether he derives it from his passage in the Gemara or from elsewhere, because the Gemara didn't say anything about Shivisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. Let's continue the Torah. V'yachshav ki'ilu haya medaber lifnei melech basar v'dam, shayom kan l'mocha b'kever. A person should think about that if he was standing in front of a human king who is today alive and tomorrow in the grave, even such a king, a person wouldn't just bumble into there and blurt out just anything he wanted to say. He would order his thoughts so that he's not going to make a mistake. And here comes the famous Kal V'chomer lifnei melech malchei amlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shetzarich lechavin af machshavto. By a human king, you have to be careful what you're going to say to him. You have to order your words properly so you don't stumble. With HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you need to also order your machshava. Kilafon of a machshava kedibur. We know that hirhur and kavanas by korbanos have just as much power as words themselves. Kilafonov in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu machshava kedibur. Ki kol machshavos hu chokir. HaKadosh Baruch Hu investigates all of our machshavos. V'chen hayu oisin chasidim v'anshe maisa shayim izbordim v'chavnim b'tfiloson ad shemagim lispashtus agashmius. So there were great early Hasidim, says the Torah, who would go into isolation, maybe even a meditation process, until they got to a point where they had reached a transcendence above their physical bodies. Ulis badruch, ulis gavrut ruach hasichlis. They want their intellectual nefesh, the part of their nefesh that is purely intellect, to be dominant. The Torah is asking a lot from us. He wants us to, like the Rambam describes Nevuah as being a highly intellectual process, getting the divine intellect in gear, as if to say. So This is not easy stuff. The Shulchan Aruch bases much of his formulation concerning halach of kavanah upon this tour, and also refers to two elements of kavanah. Let me just see who's added here. Johnny, yeah, Harold. Okay. Says the Shulchan Aruch, HaMispalot tzarich shechavin belibo perish hamilos shemotzi b'svasav. He has to understand the words. V'yakshav kilu shechina kenegdo, and he also has a thought that the shechina is in front of him. These are all like the tour. V'yaser kol ha'machshavos ha'trudos ha'suat shetishar machshavta v'chavonot ha'zacha b'tfila. Remove distracting thoughts. And he repeats, this is what we read previously. This is up until now what the Torah said. A person's davening and some foreign thought, the basketball game, an appointment he has, something that pops into his head. Yishtok, he should stop davening until this intruding machshava goes away. And he should think about things that make him more humble. And try to get his mind back on the fact that he's davening to his Father in heaven. And not to think about matters of levity. Says the Ramah, the Ramah gives us a thought, like in golf, that's like a swing thought, like a simple thought that you're supposed to have in your mind before you swing. So here the Ramah says you should have a thought that gets you going, how high Hashem is and how low the human being is in relation to him. That's your thought. That's your tefillah thought. V'yasir kol tanugei ha'adam melibo. Human pleasures should be removed from your heart. V'asur la'adam l'nashik banav aktanim beis hakneses. You shouldn't kiss your little children in shul. That you want to think about avas of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to us. So don't show ava to your little children directly in shul.
A little bit more complicated than he says. And the Rav Moshe used to kiss his grandchildren in the Beis Medrash, and he actually wrote about it and said that it was not during the tefillah. So this is a more extensive halacha than the footnote seems to refer to that, but that is the case.
Right. The last ruling of the Ramah is important and practical, as many parents are unaware that one should not kiss children in the shul. Yeah, maybe Rav Moshe was in the Beis Medrash.
He was asked about it, and he was asked about it as to why he did it, and he said that it was not during tefillah, and it was okay not during tefillah.
Okay, there you go. So, with respect to the kavanah for the meaning of the words, the Mishnah Berurah explains that one should focus only on the simple meaning of the words. So the Mishnah Berurah, commenting on the Shulchan Aruch there in Tzadik Ches, says Perish Hamilos v'yichayvin adam b'shemos yichudim. So these are kavanas that the mystical masters, they have certain kavanas during the Shem Hashem, and on the fact that Hashem is echad, various kavanas like that. He says, the Mishnah Berurah says, you don't have to do that. Rak yispalo kipshuto, lavin advarim b'chavanas alev. You should understand the words, having kavanas as heart. Imlo mishu bab b'sar Hashem. He's referring to unless you're somebody who is a master of Kabbalah or the various secrets of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The ilav hachi chas v'shalom mekalkel b'zeh harbe. If he's not a baki in those things, he's going to be mekalkel. He's going to destroy rather than elevate. Uvechuvas Marshal, Kosav Ba'oirech. He wrote about this at length. Ve'ehehid alarash she'omar achrei shalom ad sisrei Kabbalah shehu mispal ketinik ben yomo. That after he had studied the secrets of the Kabbalah, that he's davening like a 1-day-old child. So anyways, this is a little bit beyond us. I mean, if we can get to the point where we daven the Perish Amilos on every word and keep our kavana going regarding that I think is what the Mishnah Berurah is referring to. When should one try to have these two types of kavana, which we said was Perish Amilos and Shivisi Hashem Kinegdi Tomi, that we're standing in front of Hashem. Having kavana for the meaning of the words should certainly take place while one is reciting the words. Concerning the kavanah that one is standing for Hashem, the Mishnah Berurah, in the continuation of the previous passage, cites the Pnei Yoshua, who clearly indicates that it must be contemplated before beginning one's tefillah. Ayin b'Pnei Yoshua, Reish Perek Ein Omdim, shekosav, de'elu hakavanot hamarim kan b'Shulchan Aruch, the kavanah that the Shulchan Aruch is explaining, that you have to think about Hashem in a way that we are low and He is high, that has to be done before we start davening. And therefore, during davening itself, you just have to think about the Perish Amilos, the words. And this notion can be supported by the following passage from the Rambam, who writes that one should sit in quiet contemplation for a few moments before beginning to daven in order to focus one's kavanah on Hashem. Keitzad yeh kavanah? Sheyifnes libo mikol hamachshavos v'yira atzmo ki'ilu hu omed lifnei Shechina, which is what the Shulchan Aruch said. Lefichach tzorach leishev ma'at kodem atfila k'dei lechaven es libo. You should sit right before we daven. V'achar kach yispal b'nachas v'tachanunim. V'lo yaset filoso k'mishaya noisei masui u'mashlicho v'holechlo. You shouldn't, you have a burden, you want to get rid of it quickly. That's not how you should daven. Lefichach tzorach leishev ma'at achar atfila v'achar kach yipoter. After you finish Shmona Esrei, you should sit also for a little bit before you go. Chasidim Arishonim ayu shoim shah achas kodem tefillah, v'shah achas lachat tefillah, marichim b'tefillah shah. He mentions that the early Chasidim would sit for an hour before davening, and would daven for an hour, and then would sit afterwards for an hour. Okay, does the lack of either type of kavanah prevent one from filling the obligation of tefillah? We know that we learned that there's a chiyuv of tefillah, and that Shmona Esrei for us, for men, is the way we're mekayim that chiyuv. And if you don't have the kavanah of either Perish Amilos or that you're standing in front of Hashem, you notice we don't have the kavanah of being mekayim and mitzvah like we did by Kriyat Shema. Because as you know, we learned that the chiyuv of tefillah, at least by Shmona Esrei, is not necessarily on the same level regarding a mitzvah saseh, according to everybody. Some say it was, some say it was only drabana. But does the lack of having at least these two kavanas, does it interfere in the chiyuv? So what is the status of one who did not have the required kavanah? Either by not thinking about the words he was reciting, or by not considering that the Shekhinah was present before him. So in order to answer this question, you must carefully examine the Rambam's presentation of the halachos of kavanah. From the simple reading of the Rambam and the halachos below, which includes the halacha from the previous source and context, it seems that one indeed has not fulfilled his obligation when lacking the proper kavanah. Chamisha dvorim akrin satfila. 5 things prevent you from fulfilling the requirement of tefillah. Afal pi shigiyas mana, even though you're davening in the right time, taras yodayim, your hands are clean, kisuya erva, you've covered the private parts, taras makom tefillah, you've made sure that the place that you're davening doesn't have smelly items, and that the makom is appropriate. Udvormach hachoivzimoso, you've removed distracting thoughts. The kavana salev. Now, he says, what's kavana salev ketza, which we mentioned before. Called tefillah she'ena b'kavana ena tefillah. Davening without kavana is not a tefillah. V'mispala b'lo kavana choizer mispala b'kavana. The Rambam holds that if you daven without kavana, you have to go back and do it again. Motza daito mishubeshes v'libo tarud. He finds himself in a state where he's in confusion. He's thinking about other things. A person has to take the time to clear his mind. Somebody coming from the road who's tired, or meitzar, or is tense, until his mind relaxes. Chacham said, you should wait 3 days. Now, Shulchan Aruch says this rule is not allowed or followed since we are not capable of maintaining the proper kavanah during Shemona Esrei in any case. So this is the halacha of take 3 days to calm your mind. We don't follow that because we barely have kavanah during our regular Shemona Esrei. Then he says, Ketzad hiya kavanah. Sheyifnes libo mikol machshavos. He should remove all of his machshavos from his mind. V'yir atzmo kilu omed lifnei Shechina, and appear as if he's standing in front of the Shechina. He again brings the halacha that the Shulchan Aruch brought. So you can see the Shulchan Aruch Rav Yosef Karo made an amalgam from the Tur and from the Rambam, which we know the Shulchan Aruch did. I mean, the Rif, the Rosh, the Rambam. We have the same language or that's the same language he used. He again seems to be taking it from the Rambam. And then he brings the Chasidim Arishonim, Ayushonim Sha'achas, Krem Tfilah V'Sha'achas, Lachat Tfilah Marichim B'Tfilah Shah. On the other hand, so here it seems that you're not Yotzei Tfilah if you don't have the right kavanah. On the other hand, the Rambam writes later in Hilchos Tfilah, based upon Brachos 34b-6, which is quoted as well in the Shulchan Aruch 101, that if one had proper kavanah only during the first brachos of Avos, which is considered the most important of the brachos, then b'di'evid we need not recite the entire Shemona Esrei again. I'm reading footnote 6 on page 146. The Gemara states that one should have kavanah for all of the brachos, but if he's unable to do so, he should focus at least on one. The Gemara then cites the explanation that one refers to the first one, Avos. And this passage is quoted by Reb Chaim Soloveitchik in source 9 below, where Reb Chaim is going to discuss this issue. So the Rambam in Hilchos Tfilah Yud says, Mishi Spalav lo kivnes libo yachzor v'yispal b'kavana. If he didn't have kavana, he should go back and daven again b'kavana. However, in kivnes libo b'bracha rishona shuveinu tzarich. At least if he had kavana during the first bracha, he doesn't have to go back. there seems to be a contradiction in the Rambam. One can resolve the apparent contradiction in the Rambam by explaining that both halachos in the Rambam refer to kavanah for the meaning of the words. The Rambam in chapter 4, which was the first piece we learned, means that if one did not have kavanah for any of the Shemona Esrei, they must be repeated. In contrast, the Rambam in chapter 10 rules that b'di'eved, if one had kavanah during the first paragraph of Vav Solon, one has fulfilled his obligation. It should be noted that according to the Ramah in 101, which is the accepted halacha, one should not repeat the Shemona Esrei, even if one did not have kavanah during the first paragraph either, as one may not have any better kavanah during the second time, which may lead to a brachal of Atola, an unnecessary blessing. Rav Chaim Soloveitchik explains the apparent contradiction in the Rambam in a different manner. In his opinion, the two halachos of the Rambam refer to different types of kavanah, which is the way the Torah learned, right? Perish Amilos versus kavanah that you're standing in front of Hashem. The first part of the Rambam that we read in Daled refers to the kavanah standing before Hashem. There, if you have no kavanah that you're standing before Hashem, your tefillah is not a tefillah. The second Rambam, where he said, at least if you had understanding of the first paragraph, that refers to Perish Hamilos, right? The second refers to the kavanah for the meaning of the words. Let's learn this Chidush Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi in Hilchos Tefillah. Near Loimar, the Trei Gavni Kavanas Yesh B'Tefillah, Tzvei Dinim, right? The classic Rab Chaim, who very scientific, divides things into two aspects. He says there's two aspects to tefillah. Ha'achaz, kavanah shel perish hadvorim, v'yisoda hu din kavanah. The first is that you have to understand what you're saying, and that's din kavanah. Shenis. The second, shechavin shu omer b'tefillah fnei Hashem, kimavur b'dvorav Rambam perak daled. Umayi kavanah sheifnes libo mikol hamachshavos v'yiratzmo kilo omer lifnei Shechina. Nira, says the Reb Chaim, the kavanah zu einam midin kavanah. Rakshu me'etzem ma'isa tefillah. Listen, there's no tefillah if you don't realize that you're davening in front of Hashem. So he says it's not even kavanah. It's without it, there's no tefillah. Imein libo ponoi. Ve'ena rois atzmo she'omer lifnei Hashem v'mispa'in ze ma'isa tefillah. Right? You haven't even done the ma'isa tefillah if you don't know that you're standing in front of Hashem. For example, in Shabbos, you're just playing with something. It's not, you haven't had a maisa, a malacha. You're a misasek. You're just mindlessly touching something. So he equates that there's no maisa mitzvah, at least by tefillah, if you at least don't realize that you're being oimed lifnei Hashem. Therefore, al korcha ma'keves kavanah zu b'chol tefillah. This lack of recognizing that you're standing in front of Hashem is going to be ma'akev anywhere you are in Shemona Esrei. It's nothing to do with the first paragraph. And in that part of tefillah where he was misasek and not having the kavanah that he was not Hashem, that part is at least that he didn't daven at all. Ukilu diluk milos eile, as if he skipped those words. Balovadai delin etzem tefillah kol hayutos brachos ma'akvin, and therefore, if he didn't have kavanah that he was standing in front of Hashem, and for one or two or three brachos, so it's as if you had 15 brachos instead of 19 brachos. So Reb Chaim says that's why the Rambam holds that you wouldn't be Makai in the mitzvah. You'd have to go and repeat it. A person knows that he's standing in front of Hashem. It's just that he lacks the understanding of the words he's saying, Shezeh din mesuyim rak b'tefila levad, hoisafas din kavona. This is a little bit of a kiyum of the mitzvah, where it's addition to the standard kavon of knowing that you're before Hashem. Bezehu da Arei Sugya de Brachos Taf Lamed Daled. That's what the sugya in Brachos Lamed Daled we quoted in Meinu Yochel Chavin Esliba Lebekulam Yichavim Bachos Mehen. At least understand the Pirush Hamilos in the first bracha, right? Then there's a nice biography of Rav Chaim. According to Rav Chaim, the halacha concerning one who did not have kavana for the meaning of the words is the same as the accepted halacha as discussed above, which was that you don't have to go back if you didn't have Perush Hamilas kavana only in the first August. However, the halacha concerning one who did not view himself as standing before the Shekhinah is exceptionally strict. If one did not have this frame of mind during any part of Shemona Esrei, he has not fulfilled his obligation for reciting that section. In response to Rav Chaim's explanation, the Chazon Ish claims that this is not practically possible for most people to do so. To demand of a person to feel throughout his entire prayer that he is standing before a king is a very lofty demand, and that people cannot live up to it. Therefore, it's not logical to say that someone who does not meet that standard has not fulfilled his obligation. And our sages have already said in Baba Basra that deliberation and prayer is a sin from which a person is not spared each day. It means a person has this chisaron almost every day. The Chazal understood the human frailty. Chazon Ish, therefore, offered a different interpretation of the two seemingly contradictory statements in the Rambam. The Chazon Ish agrees with Rav Chaim that the Rambam in chapter 4 is not referring to Kavanah for the meaning of the words, but he explains instead that it is referring to general Kavanah that a person is engaged in tefillah and knows that he's davening. That's a pretty low bar, that at least during Shemona Esrei, you know that you're davening. You're not playing basketball. But one who did not feel for even a moment that he's standing before a king has fulfilled his obligation to pray post facto. There's no misasek if he's standing and davening. He's going to have some type of minimal awareness that he's davening. His neshama is not fully awake. The minimal awareness is enough b'di'evet. You don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. It's not entirely acceptable.
I'm wondering if that last sentence is missing the word not. But one who did not feel even for a moment that he's standing for a king has fulfilled. Maybe that should be not, according to what he's saying, and according to the words that he's saying. And but suggests that it's contrary to the previous sentence.
Where are you referring to, Yaakov?
The highlighted part at the beginning of the page, the last sentence, that's I'm sort of brown highlighting, but one who did not feel even for a moment that he's standing before a king has fulfilled his obligation to pray. I wonder if that should be not, because if you read, he says he always had a minimum awareness that he's praying for Hashem. I mean, that's what he says in the actual words in paragraph 10. Gilyonos Chazanish.
Right, but the Chazon,
that.
Yeah, in the Gilyonos, it seems that even if he had this minimal concept that he's praying to Hashem, that's enough, b'di'evet.
Yeah.
If he didn't have that, he would not be Yotzei. But if he had the minimal awareness, then b'di'evet it's acceptable. L'chatchila, they want you to have the full kavanah.
Right. But I'm wondering if that last sentence, but what who did not feel even for a moment. So that's not even having that minimal awareness.
Yeah,
I'm wondering
and
if the
based
word
on that, it should say has not fulfilled, correct. If he didn't feel for a moment, they didn't word that properly, but, we should, you know, we should send an email whenever we find something that we think might not be written properly, we should send them an email. They would want us to send them what we think the proper translation should be. They would appreciate Doron Podlashak or something. You could send me the email and we could forward it on to them.
I'd be happy to do it.
Yeah, I think it's a good point.
Yeah.
I just wanted to read the footnote on the bottom, 7. Another resolution to this machlokes in the Rambam is given by Rav Ben Sion Abba Shaul in Or L'Tzion. He suggests there that the Rambam in chapter 4, that's where you're not Yotzei, refers specifically to a lack of kavanah where all of his thoughts are about that which is disturbing him, such as the example in Halacha 1 pertaining to relieving oneself, where we said that if someone feels like he has to go to the bathroom all the time, so it's a thought that is going to disturb him throughout the davening. So Abba Shaul seems to be saying that if in your davening you had a thought throughout the davening that was mafriya you, that was disturbing you from the right kavana, that's what the Rambam is referring to when he says you're not yotzei. However, one who is davening normally, but simply cannot focus his mind sufficiently, still fulfills the minimum requirement of Shemona Esrei. That's how Abba Shaul wants to look. Back to the text in the middle of the page. In addition to the proper kavanah required, one must also recite Shemona Esrei with the proper perspective on his tefillos, as brought by Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah and Brachos. Brachos Daled Amid Beis. Oh, yeah, Mishnah Daled, Halacha Daled. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ha'oiset tfiloso kva, ain't tfiloso tachanuni. This is referring to somebody who makes just a rote. He's just davening without giving it any thought. So then, it's not a tefillah. And what does it mean, kva? In Masechta Brachos in the Gemara, explaining that Mishnah, Chavtas Amud Beis, my keva. Ar Rav Yaakov Be'idiyam Rabbi Shaya, Kol she'tfilos adoim elav kemosli. If the tefillah is like a burden, that's keva. Rabbanan Omri, Kol mi she'enu omer b'lashon tachanunim. If you're not using the language of requests, he doesn't put any emotion in it. Person has to be able to be machadesh, have some kind of novel prayer or thought. Otherwise, it's keva. It's something that you do on a regular basis without any kind of chidush. The Shulchan Aruch rules according to the first two explanations. Yispal derech tachanunim, kirash ha'mavakesh b'fesach u'lenachas. Like a poor person coming to your door, asking for something. In the footnote, it says, based on the Beis Yosef, that the word benachas is joined together with the phrase of like a poor person who asks at the entrance, rather than with the following phrase. So, kirash ha'mavakesh b'fesach u'lenachas. V'shelo tira alav kemasa u'mavakesh lipater mimena. It shouldn't look like a burden that you're trying to rush through this because it's a burden to him and he wants to be out of there. However, the Mishnah Berurah rules that these requirements do not affect b'di'eved, the efficacy of the tefillah. Kemasa, perish, avav b'shram b'loshan tachanunim, even though he is davening with emotion and like imena machashev k'mo shetzarach davar. So he should not just come to daven because he knows there's a chiyuv to daven. He has to be coming with a mind to ask something from Hashem. And it should not be a rote exercise. You should be thinking that you need these things from Hashem and you're requesting it from him. But he says, Mikol Makom b'di'evet, afilu im lo amra b'loshen tachanunim lo yachzor yispalo. The Mishnah Berurah warns us, you don't have to repeat the Shemona Esrei if you didn't have all these thoughts while you were davening. Rav Mordechai Eliyahu disagrees in theory and writes that technically one should repeat the Shemona Esrei. However, he agrees that the custom is not to repeat it in this case, since he may not have any more kavanah the second time. Says the Maimon Mordechai, Mishlo Yispal b'tachanunim, or Shispal achat tefillah isolav kamasa, if he didn't have tachanunim, or he davened it like a burden. Lefidas Rav HaPoskim tzarech lachzor lispal afilu b'zman hazeh. He brings many poskim that says you should repeat it. Aval noagu shelo lachzor lispal. The minig is not to do it. Kivan sheyesh chashash shelo yichavim lo yispal b'tachanunim gam kishpal pam shniya, and it's a bracha levatona. The Bir Halacha there by the Mishnah Berurah cites achronim more stringent, the Bach, the Eliyah Rabbah, that even b'di'evet you're not yotzei if you didn't have the proper, these concepts of yispal derech tachanunim, and that it shouldn't be like a burden. But it sounds like the minig is that the bar is lower, and that at a minimum you should have the thought that you're standing before Hashem, and that the Perush Hamilos for the first bracha of Avos. Now, sometimes, page 151, sometimes in order to help one's concentration, a person may be interested in reciting the silent Shemona Esrei aloud. One bracha states a number of places it's forbidden to raise one's voice during Shemona Esrei. So I might think that maybe a person's allowed to raise his voice during Shemona Esrei. We go all the way back to Shmuel Aleph, Perek Aleph, where Chana, the mother of Shmuel, comes to the Mishkan, where Eli HaKohen is there, and we learn a lot of the dinim of Shemona Esrei from Chana. Shenemar v'kolah lo yishma. She made sure that her voice wasn't heard. V'kolah lo yishma mikan she'asur lagbiya kol b'tfilaso. That you have to keep. It's a silent Shemona Esrei. You have to keep your voice quiet. And it says in Brachas Chaf Dal Dalet Beis, Hamashmeh Kol B'Tfilaso, Hareza Miktane Emuna. Somebody who raises his voice, he's got very little emuna. Hamashmeh Kol B'Tfilaso, Hareza Min Via Sheker. Another shot is that he's considered like a false prophet. They also would shout aloud, and Kadosh Baruch Hu hears our thoughts even in our minds. Yes, we have to enunciate with our lips, but we do it the way Chana taught us to do it. There is an exception, which the Gemara in the previous source states that one is allowed to recite the Shemona Esrei aloud, namely when one davening alone has difficulty having kavanah otherwise. Amravuna loishanu. When do we say that you should not raise your voice? As long as he has the ability to have the proper kavanah when he's davening silently. But that's when you're not going to disturb somebody else. You're davening by yourself. Well, b'tzibur asi lemidrit tzibura. You're going to disturb the tzibur by davening aloud. That you're not allowed to do. It's clear from these passages in the Gemara that in most cases one should recite Shemona Esrei quietly. Must one pronounce the words loud enough that one can hear them oneself? The Tosefta indicates that not only is one not required to hear them oneself, one should not recite the words loud enough to hear them oneself. Yachli mashmeh kolo, says the Beis Yosef le'oznov, pirish b'chana shenemar, v'chana hi medaber saliba. Chana was talking internally. She was not talking to make her words heard by her own ears. The Yerushalmi, however, indicates the opposite. Ideally, one should be able to hear the words when reciting Shemona Esrei, though the lack of hearing them does not invalidate the tefillah. This differs from the halach of Kriyat Shema, where Rabbi Yosei held that not hearing the words does in fact invalidate the recitation. The Yerushalmi says, Tani, Nispal Avo Yishmei La'ozno Yotza. Somebody davened, didn't hear it with his ears, he's still Yotzei. Lemi Nitzrachel Rav Yosei. This is a chiddush for Rav Yosei. Hayed Rav Yosei chaded the Tani Akor Shema V'lo Yishmei La'ozno Yotza. Rav Yosei Mer Lo Yotza. Because this is, we know Rav Yosei's opinion by Kriyat Shema is that if you didn't hear the words with your ears, you were not Yotzei. So that's why we have to be told here. That's why it was important here to know that by Tefillah Shemona Esrei, if you did not hear what he said, you're still Yotzei. Says the Pnei Moshe in explanation, Ayed Rav Yosei, Ezer Rav Yosei. Which Rav Yosei we talk about? V'kamer Hada de Taninan. And that the one that was brought in Kriyat Shema, Kloimar, to Rav Yosei, according to Rav Yosei, this feeling must need to be Kriyat Shema, but the Eved Lo Yotza, who holds that the Kriyat Shema, if you didn't recite the words with being able to hear them, even b'di'evid, you're not Yotzei. Kamash Malan, the Betfila Moidu, the b'di'evid Yotza. The Loksiv Bashma. There it says Shema Yisrael. Your ears should hear it. But by Shemona Esrei, we don't have such a directive of Shema. So therefore, now the Rambam, Falzi Rishonim, writes that one should recite Shemona Esrei loud enough that he can hear his own voice quietly. Hashavas HaKol Ketzad. How should you modulate your voice? Lo Yagbia Kolo B'Tfiloso. Shouldn't raise his voice. Lo Yispal B'Libo. It shouldn't be strictly in his heart that you're thinking about it. You have to say, you have to recite each word like in a whisper, in a sense. That through a whisper you might be able to hear it in your ears. Shulchan Aruch, another Achronim, rule in accordance with the Yerushalmi. In addition, the Shulchan Aruch codifies the Gemara in source 18 above concerning when one may recite the tefillah out loud. Lo yispal b'libo levad. You shouldn't just think about the words. You gotta pronunciate every word. As if you're whispering to yourself. But you got to do it in a way that other people don't hear. You can't have kavanah quietly. You can even raise your voice. That's as long as he's by himself. He's not with other people that he's going to disturb them. You certainly cannot raise your voice during Shemona Esrei because Osi Lemitra Tzibur. He's going to come to disrupt the Tzibur. Says the Ramah, Imashmiya Kol B'Veso K'Mish Mispalo, K'dei Shli'anam Mimenu B'nei Veso Mutter. If he's going to pray aloud, because he's killing two birds with one stone. He's teaching the people in his family how to pray, then certainly it's permitted. The Mishnah Baruch clarifies that ideally, the Shemona Esrei should be recited loud enough that one can hear oneself, but quietly enough that others nearby will not hear. I'm Birkei Yosef, L'chai Odem, L'chadchila tzarech l'spal b'lachash kol kach, shav chaver oime b'samach lo yeh yuchal lishmoa. You have to be able to daven silently enough that if somebody's standing next to him, he wouldn't be able to hear him. In efshar lo l'chavin b'inyan zeh, yeshu lasos b'inyan sheyach l'chavin ach sheyizar shlo yitrud lachem miklakamei. He can do it a little louder, that allows him to concentrate, but again, you must be careful not to disturb somebody else. The Yalkut Yosef writes that Sephardim as well should recite the tefillah in a manner that is audible at least to oneself. Aval pi sheyesh cholkim al maron, there are people who argue with the Shulchan Aruch. V'sovrim shelo yashmi'a af la'oznav, and they hold that you should just think about the words, not necessarily recite them at all. Ha'ikr k'divrei maron. The halacha is like the Shulchan Aruch. Ubeprat sha'yidei shemashmi'a la'oznav yuchal avates atevos shemitfilah kalacha. In order to have your ear hear it, you have to enunciate each word. You have to be able to enunciate each word. So that will allow him to have proper kavanah. Rav Mordechai Leon notes that the Zohar, which is also cited by the Beis Yosef, cautions not to recite the Shemona Esrei loud enough to be heard with one's own ears, but rather to enunciate the words with one's lips. Based on this, Rav Eliyahu writes that the Sephardic custom is not in accordance with the ruling of the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. The ahit slusa ishtamid udnan davarnash. If we are able to hear with our ears, less mandat saisle le'ele. V'lot saisle achrinan barman deshama bekadmisa. It's not going to be accepted. Begin kach boy li istamra d'lo yashminan lahit slusa b'nei nasa. He must be careful that no one should listen to his words. Therefore, his words will unite in the upper worlds. One won't have to recite it for anybody to hear, because it's going to a high place. Let's read it in Hebrew. If the words of the tefillah are heard by his ears, there's nobody in Shemayim who's going to be able to receive that tefillah. He has to make sure that this may refer to interlocutors, davening to people who it'll go from one place to another. So you may be careful not to have your neighbor hear your davening. The words of tefillah are unified in the upper world. Those words, nobody has to hear those words. So these are mystical concepts, obviously. Says the Maimer Mordechai, right? The Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. L'das maron tzorech lashmiya rak la'oznav shel hamispal atzmos tfilas yud ches. Shulchan Aruch says person has to hear his own words. L'das hazoyar ein lashmiya afil oznav. The Zohar says you shouldn't listen to your ears either. You shouldn't recite it loud enough for even you to hear. Just with the movement of your lips. That's the minig. But if he doesn't say it loud enough that he can hear it, his kavanah is not going to be good. Or he'll skip words. Mutar lo lashmiya la'oznav. In order to help him with his proper kavanah, he can recite it loud enough to hear. So he wouldn't interfere with his neighbor. The Beis Yosef notes that there was a custom in the earlier times to recite the Shemona Esrei aloud on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It means this, even though during the rest of the year, your Shemona Esrei should not be recited aloud, on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur they did. Despite the fact that most sources we saw above do not allow reciting it aloud, the Beis Yosef provides justification for the custom of reciting it aloud Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Says the Beis Yosef in his commentary on the Tur, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur noagim olam lashmiya kolam b'tfilosam. People recited the Shemona Esrei louder. V'utmiya lituva, Heichnis Pashta Minig Hazeh. The Beis Yosef is wondering, how did that minig spread? We just said that it's not appropriate. Isi b'mei Charfi, the Sefer HaPliya, he says when he was younger, he saw in a Sefer Pliya, that he criticized that custom of reciting it aloud Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. He saw in the Piskei HaTosfos Masechta Rosh Hashanah, Zeh L'shonai, brachos to Rosh Hashanah mitoch the ein regilim bahem. Remember, every day we recite the same Shemona Esrei, so we're very accustomed to recite them. But the tefillas in Rosh Hashanah, like Musaf particularly, we're not rogil in those words. So therefore, mashmim kolam. So they raise their voice. There's longer blessings. It may confuse it. It may confuse others when reciting aloud. That's why the Chazan is so important on Yom Kippur, because he has to be motzi everybody, because they're confused with other brachas, especially when reciting it aloud. So the Beis Yosef says, at least this explains why people are reciting them louder, because it aids in their kavanah, because they're so unused to the nusach of the davening. He says another reason, Lefishem Yimei Tshuva, it's Yimei Tshuva, Mashmim Kolam, K'dei L'chaven Yoser. They want to have better kavanah. The Ayid Chavivi Lahu, and these tefillos are very dear to people. Yavu Daitayu Ve'ena Matim Zed Zed. The fact that one person is davening loud, they don't get bothered or confused by the fact that their neighbor's davening a little louder. Aval Pish Mashmim Kolam. He must have been a young man when he wrote it. He kept it in his Gilyonos. Then later on in life, Mordechai, in the Mordechai was the Rishon, the Masechta Yuma, Aval Pish Kol Yemos Hashanah Mispan Belachash, K'dilfina Perkei Nomdim, Mikroyet Dechana, right? Even though the rest of the year we learned from the Psukim of Chana that we daven quietly, the Kol Lo Yishma, Miud, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, Oimer B'Kol Ram. You can say it louder. So he noticed that the Mordechai was machav into his own thoughts, and the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah accept this custom. To raise one's voice in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur is a valid one. Yesh Oimrim, referring to the space Yosef, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur mutar lashmiya kolam b'tfilah afilu b'tzipor. Ramah v'chein noyagim v'makom yizar shalagbir kolam yoser midai. So despite the defense of the custom of the Beis Yosef, most of the Achronim rule that's better to pray silently, including the Mishnah Berurah and the Yalkut Yosef. Afilu b'tzibur, says the Mishnah Berurah on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, la'ora kavana, that some people did daven aloud, u'lemitrit tzibur l'cheshina, we weren't concerned that it would bother the tzibur, kivan shesidur machzorim b'yodam, since their machzors in front of them, Ein Magen Avram, the Masik. The Magen Avram argued. He said, the Yoser told his Papa Lachash Em Yochel L'Chaven, that if you can have kavanah, you should again daven quietly. Says the Yalkut Yosef, right? The pshat of the psak of Rav Ovadia, a dot communities. Shenogu shashlech tzibur omer b'kol ram tfilas arvi shel leila yom tov v'shel leila yom neiroim yesh lo mamash yismachu. In those communities, the Tfilat Shibur would recite the whole thing out loud. Like we go, many of us who've davened in a Sephardi minyan will hear the Chazan recite everything out loud. He brings the meaning of Yontiv and the Yom Neiroim. Certainly they did that. You shouldn't be mevatel. We call makom im kol hakol yodim mispalim mitoch hamauser. If everybody knows how to daven from the Mauser, maskimim levatel minakam bezeh, and they agree to mevatel that minig, lotzei zidei chachamim kupolim tov aleim bracha, right? Because it's better we saw that the Kabbalists felt it was better to daven silently, right? We brought the Zohar. Okay, now we're going to stop, and the various hefsekim. When are you allowed to be mafsik during Shemona Esrei? We'll talk. We'll pick up with that next week. Does anybody have any other comments to make or questions or?
Yeah, I understand this, the thing about davening loud, because overriding, and one of the reasons we actually daven malachas is because other people aren't disturbed. So what are we making a special exception or Shon Yom Kippur? Now everyone can get daven loud on your Shon Yom Kippur.
So you saw the Mishnah, both the Mishnah Berurah and the Yalkut Yosef says that you should avoid that minhag. We're not noeg like the way Reb Chaim says, but the Beis Yosef gave a svara Chaim that everyone has a machzor in front of them. They all know the davening. It's very chaviv to them. They wouldn't be as easily disturbed by hearing their neighbor daven as they would during the rest of the year. That's what the.
That's probably true. I mean, I guess it's like a minhag makom. Like, if you go to like yeshivas, right? And you go to yeshiva, you see everybody saying the davening, saying the Shema loud. I mean, people are, it's like the minhag there is everyone can like say it, in a louder voice. It's like a whole hum that you hear. But some places people, say no. Here it's a library. We daven in silence, and if someone makes noise, it disturbs everybody. So
no, but Chaim, you saw that there's a major distinction between Kriyas Shema and Shmon Esrei. Kriyas Shema, you have to be mashmiya la'ozno. So there, by Kriyas Shema, it's certainly okay to recite it aloud. By Shmon Esrei is when they don't want them reciting it aloud because you have to have more kavana, etc. And there's no din of Shema la'ozno because it doesn't say Shema by Shmon Esrei. So if you walk into most yeshivas, it's dead silent during Shemona Esrei.
Absolutely, and in Israel also in the yeshivas it was very quiet. I don't remember. By Shema, of course, it's noisy, but they make a noise. But basically, the rest it's quiet.
Right.
Okay, Ernie Shkoyach.